West Feliciana Parish is a farm parish. They had us so that we were solely dependent on the landowner. We lived on the fat of the land because there wasn't no money.
There was not much opportunity in hardwood other than working at the sawmill. Streets was bad, houses was bad. It just was bad.
In the 1800s and most of the 1900s, farming and working for sawmills were common ways for black people to get by in just about every southern community in the United States. But there was something different in rural West Feliciana Parish. Its population has never exceeded 12,000, excluding the inmates at Angola State Prison. But West Feliciana has produced an exceptional number of black professionals.
Everything that you can name came out of Dawson High School. It's because the kids was more focused on their education and what could I do to better my condition.
Many blacks collectively look back on our challenges and wonder how we got over.
How I got over, how I got over, oh, my soul looks back and wondered how I got over, how I got over, how I got over, oh, my soul looks back.
The very foundation of West Feliciana Parish was based mostly on farming. The area had been under Spanish, French, and British rule. After the Louisiana Purchase, it had even been the capital of the West Florida Republic before becoming part of the United States. White families were given thousands of acres of land through land grants. Some people were rewarded for military service. Others were induced to move to the Deep South to develop farmland. Still others were given land because of their relationships with the people in power, who wanted trusted supporters in certain areas. Some of these new landowners were already rich, and they wanted to build on their wealth by farming cotton and livestock. The European families often rode wagons and horses as their enslaved workers walked from the northeastern corner of the country to the Deep South. They brought with them cattle and hogs. That journey was roughly 900 miles. Others traveled by sea from the Carolinas, Virginia, and other states, and from other countries by ship to Louisiana. The trip down the Atlantic coast through the Gulf of Mexico and up the Mississippi was sometimes thousands of miles. Once the settlers arrived on their land, they made the workers clear the trees, including deeply rooted stumps, cultivate the soil and plant crops of cotton, sugarcane, and other vegetables and fruit trees. Cattle and horse pastures and hog pens also had to be built. The ultimate goal of the move south was to raise enough cotton for the global markets. Once picked, the cotton would be shipped by train or boat downriver to New Orleans, where cotton agents or brokers would find markets to ship the cotton all over the world. In the 1830s, West Feliciana became the first place in the United States to operate an interstate railroad service. The train went from Woodville, Mississippi, to a shipping dock at Bayou Sarah, an area on the banks of the Mississippi River near modern-day St. Francisville. By the 1840s, West Feliciana farmers had roughly 40,000 acres of land planted in cotton, yielding about 40,000 bales. A bale was about 400 pounds. Farmers had also accumulated about 3,000 heads of cattle. They raised roughly 190 bushels of corn to feed their families, the enslaved workers, and the livestock. A bushel of shelled corn weighs roughly 50 pounds. Sweet potatoes, Irish potatoes, and bean crops were also popular. An 1860 census report shows West Feliciana Parish had a population of roughly 12,000 people, a vast majority of whom were enslaved. Blacks outnumbered whites by 3.5 to 1, enough to manage crops that thrived in Louisiana's warm climate and fertile soil, sometimes fertilized by the rich silt from the Mississippi River when it overflowed its banks. At least 20 planters each held more than 100 people as property. Then came the Civil War. Many plantation owners left their farms to fight for their way of life. Some perished. Some came home with deep battle scars. Many gave up their cash for the cause, but their descendants still live in the lavish homes built by slaves on property donated to their families more than 150 years earlier. Other families prospered by selling the houses and the land. The war ended with a declaration that called for the end of slavery. It was a turbulent time for both the landowners and the former slaves. Many of the freed men and women willingly headed north or west in search of a better place and a better life. And some landowners encouraged former slaves to leave because they didn't want to continue providing a roof over their heads. The planters and ranchers didn't know how hard the former slaves were willing to work once they were free. And some of the former slaves stayed in the meager houses they had been living in all along and tried to negotiate better conditions with the landowners.
Some people say, oh, you done sold yourself to the landowner. But if you don't have nothing, and there's a trade-off, I'm gonna take care of you, but you're gonna work for me. You're gonna have grocery, you're gonna have a roof over your head. You ain't got to worry about no light bill, water bill, gas bill. So that's what you call selling yourself to the landowner, then yeah. But you got to start from somewhere.
Vincent Smith, his parents, Nathaniel and Sally, and his 10 brothers and sisters lived on one of 3 plantations owned by Douglas Hampton. The children went to the fields as soon as they were old enough to work.
And the plantation when I was born on was called inherited. Douglas Hampton was the owner. Across the road was West Inherited Plantation, owned by the same man. Across the road was Tangawai Plantation, owned by the same man. And we rented land. We didn't work on the 4th or the 3rd. All what we made was ours. But he fixed it so that we never could make money. Just say we made $500. The rent was $200. And then you had to go and take up all the year to make it. And so when he run up the figures, you always come out even. Well, Nathaniel, you did good this year, you broke even. That means you didn't make nothing, but you don't owe nothing. If you needed plow points and ropes and gears and chains and whatever you needed to run the farm, and we had a store up there, Morgan and Damps run the store. And Douglas would go there and say, give Nathaniel credit, and give this one credit, and give that. So we go take up the grocery. And so you had to pay all that at the end of the year. Sharecropping, if you worked on the 3rd or the 4th, the man get 3 and you get 1. All we had to buy was salt and pepper for the eating concern. We ate peas one day, butter bean the next day, okra. We ate off the fat of the land. Our meat was squirrel and rabbit. Killed the hog in the wintertime, and then we didn't have electricity. So we had to salt the meat down to keep it. Everybody had hog, because hog was a way of life. We had 3 cows, we had the milk, And then we made butter from the milk. Most of the school clothes, my auntie made them. The pants, the shirts, and all. It just wasn't no money.
The Reverend Olton Scott's parents rented land from Mary Willis, which was just a few miles from the Smiths. The Scotts were a family of 10, the parents and 8 children. 2 other black families lived on the estate. The landowner's husband was dead, and she relied heavily on the Scotts to help manage her fields and farm animals. The Scotts fared better with their finances than the Smiths and were able to stash away some money. Several other black families lived on the nearby Emile Marchieve property.
The Washington, the Allen, the Temple, the Johnson, all of us grew up in that same neighborhood. And growing up in that same neighborhood, all of our parents was farmers.
Steve Williams Sr. was able to buy land in 1918. His sons and grandchildren lived on his property about 10 miles from the Smiths. The Williams had to work as hard as everyone else to keep food on the table.
I can remember my mother sending us to pick blackberries. She was setting canned blackberries for weeks at a time, batch after batch after batch. There'd be hundreds of jars of blackberries, of peaches, of tomatoes, of okra, of butterbean. That stuff was put in jars, preserved, and set back. So you could go and get that whenever you needed something. You get a quart of blackberries and some flour dough dumplings, and you had a good meal. You wasn't hungry, and you liked it. And believe it or not, she could order chickens through the mail. They would come to the main post office in Woodville. It was coming from across the country. Come there, the mailman, Mr. Green, would pick those chickens up. Hot weather, just like it is now. Put them in that truck, shade them, make sure they had water and feed, bring them, blow at the mailbox and wait till somebody come up and pick them.
Cotton had been king in West Feliciana Parish before the Civil War. Planters had gathered as much as 40,000 bales a year. But by 1865, the year the war ended, West Feliciana farmers harvested only about 800 bales of cotton. As the 1870s progressed, it was evident that the profits from cotton would never return to pre-war levels. Cotton was selling at high prices right after the war, but most farmers had skimpy crops because of overuse of soil, too much rain, and infestations of worms. Some landowners also suffered labor shortages. By 1910, experts were urging West Feliciana farmers to burn their cotton crops to get rid of destructive boll weevils. The insects ravaged many fields, eating buds and flowers before the plants had a chance to produce cotton. With low income for the plantation owners and even less for the workers, some black men made extra money by helping to harvest sugarcane. It was a popular crop just across the Mississippi River in Princeville Parish and further downriver.
After they finish up with their crops around last of October, then they would go to the cane farm and they would cut cane until Christmas. Usually the cane harvest would be done by Christmas. And if they could find something to do during the winter months, they would do it, but it wasn't that much to do.
With all of the sweat and occasionally tears that black people shed, there was one constant in their lives: Sunday morning church services. Even before they had church buildings, the slaves had learned to worship God through prayer and song. Just about every plantation supplied workers with a place to worship. Church services were packed, and music was an integral part of the experience.
There's nothing else to rely on. We have to do something to relieve pressure and pain and tension. And we sang. Many of the songs, praise songs and whatnot, they come directly from the Bible. The book of Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, those are songs. The entire book of Psalms is a song. And we sing many of those songs. I will lift my eyes unto the hills, total praise. That just makes it more meaningful, and you can really get into it. You kind of express yourself. Other ones that you'll hear every now and then, guide me, O thou great Jehovah. It's a neat guidance.
They were work songs, message songs. That was their newspaper also.
Every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Yes, every time I feel the Spirit moving in my heart, I will pray. Upon the mountain I was born.
While earning a living was very tough for blacks, things were looking up on another front. 2.5 decades after the end of slavery, in 1890, John Sterling Dawson arrived in West Feliciana to help educate the former slaves and their descendants. He was greeted at the train station by a train conductor, who was also the postmaster for the Laurel Hill community, Charles H. Argue. A man only identified as John Jones was traveling with Argue. Argue lived within a couple of miles of where Dawson would begin teaching in Laurel Hill. The 19-year-old Dawson proved to be smart, wise, and dedicated far beyond his years.
He came to our church to ask the pastor and the deacons could he set up a school in the church. And they said, yeah.
It said that they had about 125 kids and only about 20 could read. You have a tremendous task there. But he was smart enough to know since he couldn't do it, he had to develop what he called a grade A class, students who learn a little faster, and he got them to help him to teach the other kids. He must have been a genius, really.
Within a couple of years of John Dawson's arrival in West Feliciana, 3 white men, Vincent Jackson, Vincent Walsh, and Sidney Howard Lemon, put up land to build a school for blacks. Black men in the community hewed the lumber, led by carpenters Andrew Bowers and Huey Dillon.
We used to go walk to Laurel Hill School, and then they built Polk School. Polk School and Laurel Hill were the only 2 schools that were built just for school. The rest of them were in churches, and the school come out of the church. Solitude the same way. They built the school, but that was way later years.
It's unclear how much education Dawson had upon arriving in the community of Laurel Hill. He, however, earned 3 college degrees while there. A degree from Natchez College in 1903, one from Southern University in 1924, and one from Leland College in 1936. The professor, as he was called, was able to quickly determine which students had reached a level where they could teach others the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. He then sent his protégés to other locations to teach so they could reach every corner of the parish.
John Dawson was the reason for all this. He went to Hickory Grove, Bishop Grove, most all the churches, Chevrolet Valley, setting up schools, because black didn't have cars, and you had to put a church or a school every 5 miles so we could walk to school.
When we came home from school during the farm time, we had to go in the field. And many times we had to go in the field in the morning before we go to school in order to put out fertilizer around corn or something so Daddy could plow all day.
Many students missed days and weeks of school at a time because of planting and harvesting seasons. Nonetheless, within a few years, every school-aged child in West Feliciana Parish had learned to read and write, add and subtract. Some of Dawson's early students proved skillful at advanced math.
When I finished elementary school in St. Francisville, I went to Woodville to work at the Sawmill. And I worked at the Sawmill up there for a couple of years before I came to Southern University. And I was running the company, shipping lumber and everything. And I wouldn't get paid for it. The white shipping clerk was getting paid for it, but he was always sending more lumber than was necessary. And so I would figure the lumber out. Mr. Huggins, that's who superintendent of that sawmill at that time. It was the Ransom Lumber Company. He would take the shipping clerk away just to let me run the company. And so my daddy came up there, Woodville, Mississippi, and saw that I was shipping all the lumber and went out into town, and everybody was talking about the little black boy, who wouldn't call me by that name then, was down there shipping lumber. And say he keeps a sharp pencil, meant that I figured out exactly what they ordered.
That's when Johnny Jones's father picked him up from Woodville and took him to Southern University. He would eventually get a law degree and become one of the leading civil rights attorneys in Louisiana. 14 years after John Sterling Dawson arrived in West Feliciana Parish, a black landowner, Henry Polk, donated land for the construction of an even larger school for black children. By the time Polk died in 1905, his will showed that he had somehow accumulated almost 1,000 acres of land. A decade after Polk died, one of the founders of Sears and Roebuck, Julius Rosenwald, and the great black educator Booker T. Washington got into the business of helping to build schools for young blacks. The Polk-Rosenwald School opened in the 1920s with the help of Polk's land, and Rosen family continued to work the property owned by Douglas Hampton until Sally Smith's sister offered them an opportunity they could not resist.
My dad would say I wasn't born. He could have had the whole place, 800 and some acres, for $6,000. And Mr. Fugel told him whatever he could afford to pay. He didn't have no special note. Everything was paid on farm time, wasn't no money. My dad was scared to take the chance. So my auntie, Amelia Brown, went to California, San Francisco. She started working, and she was making a little money. And in 1938, my daddy bought this place, 162 acres for $6,000. My auntie in California helped from 32 to 38. He could have had 800 acres for $6,000. Now I got 162 for $6,000.
Once the Smiths were able to purchase their own land, they began to accumulate things.
We didn't have nothing, but we lived good, happy, bought land, cars, brand new trucks. We did good with a little.
In 1951, the state of Louisiana and the parish of West Feliciana built the first school large enough to accommodate black high school students. John Sterling Dawson died that same year. The new school was named John S. Dawson High in his honor. By then, he had taught for 58 years, and he had raised all four of his children to become educators. Both of his sons, John Dawson Jr. and Thomas, would serve as principals in the parish schools. Dawson High closed in 1969 because of integration, but by then, the Dawsons had instilled a culture within the black community that strongly embraced education.
African American students in West Feliciana Parish outperformed their peers across the state and indeed across the nation in many categories. And much of that is due to the priority of education in the culture of West Feliciana Parish that crosses all racial lines, it crosses all economic lines.
Vincent Smith's father, Nathaniel, was one of John Dawson's students. That may have been why the older Smith was adamant about making sure that all of his children got a good education. They also, however, had to keep up with work on the farm, especially since they had broken ties with the old plantation owner. The Smiths were forced to stop raising cotton when the local gin went out of business in 1957, probably because of fewer growers and low crop yields. It almost appeared as if divine intervention had taken over. Another crop had gained popularity in West Feliciana Parish: sweet potatoes. The Truitt family of Princeville, Illinois were in the canning business, preserving vegetables in cans for market. Most of the vegetables were available for harvest and then canning from mid to late summer. The Truitts wanted a product that would take their work well into the fall and winter.
My father, Jordan Truitt, and his grandfather came down to Louisiana and went initially to LSU and made contact with Dr. Julian Miller. They sent him up to Harry Daniel in West Feliciana Parish.
That was in the mid to late 1930s, around the same time that LSU researcher Dr. Julian C. Miller was perfecting the highly desirable Puerto Rican potato. The large-scale farmer, Harry Daniel, was following Miller's progress and adjusting his crops based on Miller's discoveries. Dr. Miller had traveled globally to learn more about the vegetable and to get tested and retested products and methods before achieving success.
Some of their labels were advertised the fact they were Puerto Rican varieties. They tasted really good, but there are other factors that go into the decision about what variety to use. The grower, of course, is interested in yield, and the more pounds per acre or tons per acre, the better. But also the canning process wanted a potato that would not break down, which would be firm. And so varieties evolve.
The Truitts were so smitten with the Puerto Rican potatoes that they started having them shipped from Louisiana to Princeville, Illinois, not far from Peoria. But the shipping process had serious flaws.
There was no such thing as refrigerated rail cars, and so they would have a layer of sweet potatoes and then a layer of dry ice. In those days, even a lickety-split rail train would take 3 or 4 days to get to Illinois, and so there'd be considerable product loss. Initially, they tried to grow sweet potatoes in Illinois to prevent the freight cost and the raw product loss, but there was a limit on availability of seed vines for sweet potatoes. And so they ultimately decided, well, we should probably just build a plant in Louisiana. So they built the plant here in St. Francisville.
The decision by the Truitts to build in Louisiana would prove to be quite beneficial to the entire parish, which was struggling after the decline of the cotton industry. Princeville opened its St. Francisville plant in 1945.
They branded the product, the Royal Prince brand and the Princeville brand and also the Jack-o'-lantern brand. And they had a network of brokers all over the country, Southern California, Philadelphia, Chicago, New York, et cetera, and it exploded actually. It's difficult these days to think that a canned product would do so well, but it really did. And this was the 1930s and early 1940s. The demand grew, and as the demand grew, the acreage required to grow sweet potatoes grew as well.
As the demand for sweet potatoes grew rapidly across the country, the need for more product increased, and the need for farmers increased.
There was a ready workforce because there wasn't a lot of employment in the region at all. People were eager to find steady jobs. Over time, about half of the workers came from West Feliciana Parish, but other workers came from the Woodville area, Wilkinson County. Some came even from New Roads. Many came from East Feliciana as well. And in the beginning, those that did not have transportation, we had buses to go pick up the workers and bring them to work.
I went to work at Princeville Canning Company in 1964. I was putting the potatoes in the can and put them on the run. Some people came in their cars and truck and all, coming from all directions. That was probably the biggest job in St. Francisville.
My mother worked at Princeville, and we sold potatoes to Princeville. And that's how we made it. She was making that little money, whatever, 50 cents an hour. But back then, that was good money.
They were happy to have a paycheck. I was happy to have a paycheck too. I used to work summers in the canning factory, and I did lots of jobs from the receiving area to loading the rail cars and whatnot, and I always worked alongside other workers. So I interacted directly as a young person with these seasoned employees that were thrilled to death to have jobs, and they worked hard.
The plant generally operated from midsummer well into winter. Workers not only canned sweet potatoes, they also made a German potato salad for national distribution. There was quite a process from offloading the raw potatoes at the plant to shipping the canned product off to market. Fortunately for the local people, a lot of manpower was required.
The trucks were manually offloaded, and then they were put on pallets, and forklifts carried the pallets to the entry place of the plant, and the potatoes were dumped into a series of processes that would eliminate the peel from the potato. Initially, it went into a caustic soda bath. Caustic soda is a basic ingredient. The pH is high. And then it would go into a steam bath. Sprays would knock the peel off. And then the potatoes would go down a broad line. And workers would inspect the potatoes for color and size. And there were cans positioned above the lines on a conveyor belt. And they would fill the cans by hand, depending on color and size. And then the cans would be conveyed to a sealing machine, which would seal the cans. And then they would go into a retort basket, and they would be filled, and they were vertical retorts up and down. The potatoes would be cooked in the retort, and then they would be unloaded. Those were pretty much done by hand, but they were also scraped off and then put into the warehouse when it was time for labeling. Demand would emerge from the marketplace, and then they would be boxed and put on a rail car and shipped to the market. There was a rail spur, Illinois Central, that went all the way down to Princeville Canning Company. It went up through Bayou Sara, and then it connected with the major Illinois Central line.
With the processing running smoothly, the Truitts were able to hire additional workers.
But it ultimately grew to about 850 workers over 2 shifts.
The owners of the factory began to see their workers becoming more independent in many ways.
You could observe the evolution of wealth from individual families, automobiles, houses, land, and so forth and so on. I mean, it was visible, and it really triggered the local economy. What you see today is a thriving economy, but it had its beginning really back in those days, because it was dirt poor.
My husband was working construction work in Baton Rouge. I went to work at Princeville. We was raising sweet potatoes, mashed potatoes. We had to work real hard to get what we got. We was able to save our money and bought the land and built the house.
More people bought land, built houses, bought trucks and cars since Princeville come. You pick cotton a whole week, and you carry it to the gin, you make $160, something like that. Sweet potato, you make that every day. But it's a seasonal thing, just like cotton.
As the demand for more canned potatoes increased, the Truitts discovered they needed to become farmers too. The market was demanding more sweet potatoes than the local farmers could produce, and Princeville had the capacity to can far more sweet potatoes than were coming in. So they established a farming operation as well.
The son of Harry Daniel was Ed Daniel, and my father and Ed Daniel became partners in the farming operation. Ultimately, it took 4,000 to 5,000 acres of sweet potatoes, and Daniel and Truitt Farming grew about 1,000 acres of sweet potatoes, and the rest came from nearby growers.
I went to work for Princeville when we finished setting out potatoes or when we finished digging potatoes. I couldn't go when it's time for me to be in my field or my daddy's field. Princeville was the only place that hiring blacks. They had blacks working in the fields year round, and they had the women coming to the factory from August till December.
I enjoyed it. It was big time farming. I was a tractor driver most of the time, but I was also riding horses, handling cattle.
Daniel and Truitt relied heavily on hired hands, and many of the field workers received checks for their labor for the first time.
For the most part, people just had to be willing to work, which they were eager to do. I mean, it wasn't hard to convince somebody to work hard in those days.
The men scouted the parish to find land that was not overgrown and could easily be turned into farmland. One of the places that Jordan Truitt, the newcomer from Illinois, looked at was the land surrounding the Rosedown plantation.
I remember coming out here with my dad and visiting there. It was nothing like it is now. They were probably interested in anybody that was interested in this place. This place was a wreck at that time, and they really had no idea what to do with the home. And I'm sure the gardens were a part of that. My mother told my wife that they almost bought a plantation. It wound up in the right hands. The Underwoods did a magnificent job with this whole place.
While farming was big in West Feliciana, there was another industry that was perhaps as old as farming, running sawmills. The need for lumber was steady as more people from other states and countries settled in West Feliciana and needed homes. There were 3 sawmills in the parish for much of the 1900s. There was one near Woodville, Mississippi, one in the community of Hardwood near St. Francisville, and another in Tunica, a few miles from the Angola State Penitentiary.
A gentleman from Colorado had bought that property and started a little small mill there, and that was early 20s, I think. About 1925, they moved the operation up to Tunica and built a much larger mill. It's called Tunica Hardwood Lumber Company. It began operation up there about 1925. It was a steam-operated boiler room. I guess at its height, I would say there were over 100 employees there. It was a very large operation. 95% were probably African American.
Logs that were to be sliced into lumber were often shipped on barges down the Mississippi River.
The log trucks would go down to the river. Some of the drivers were African American of the log trucks, and then they had workers at the river itself because the barges came in and there was a drag line that loaded the logs onto the trucks, and workers had to be there to make sure the logs were stacked properly and then chained up so that they would stay on the truck, and then they brought them up to the mill.
Every log that went through the sawmill had to go through the hands of several people before it became timber ready for sale.
The log is loaded on what is called the carriage. It's the entire tree after the limbs and everything are cut off. And then there's a saw that the sawyer operates this machine, the carriage, and it runs back and forth, sawing the log into pieces of lumber. And then it goes to what they call the resaw, which sort of trims it up. And then they had an edger, which also did a little more trimming. And then it went out on what they call the green chain. There was a lumber inspector there, and they had to grade the lumber based on the quality of what was coming out of there. Then it left the green chain, and then that's when it was taken out and stacked on the yard for it to be air dried.
Mike Clark's father, Monroe Clark, was a manager at the sawmill. Clark says that black and white workers were often segregated, but their living conditions were very similar. Operators of sawmills had a pattern of building small shotgun houses with 3 or 4 rooms for all of their workers and their families.
Almost all of them were just little shotgun houses, basically, with the ones we lived in had the tar paper siding. Kind of looked like brick, but it was artificial tar paper, pretty much the same. And what they call the quarters. The wages were low, but of course, cost of living was lower, and being able to have housing was really a big thing.
During the 1800s and early 1900s, sawmill operators would pack up and move their equipment with workers to different sites once they used up the timber supply in a particular area. The hardwood sawmill had done just that.
When King Edward had hardwood, where it was Tall Bennett first, come from Grenada, Mississippi, and they brought all their workers with them. And they hired a few from West Feliciana, but All those people come in here with the sawmill, and they built them little shotgun houses right next to one another. They didn't pay no rent, no electric bill. The company paid everything because they didn't make much, but they didn't have no expense.
It was dirty, streets was bad, the houses was bad, and everything. It just was bad.
Had their own big store out there on the road. That's the way they made it. Because they could go to the hole and get money.
Going to the hole meant getting items on credit or borrowing money at the store. By payday, some workers didn't have much of a check left because they owed money to the store, which had a partnership with the paper mill. The neighborhood was known for its rowdy juke joint. The blues played loudly and the crowds danced with rhythm and joy just about every Friday and Saturday night.
A lot of it's entertainment. We had to do stuff to entertain ourselves. When they go to clubs and whatnot, it was for entertainment, just to do something different. That's okay.
Now go right loose in my house. You only come out when I'm not at home. I can all right loose in my house. You only come out when I'm gone.
The sawmill in Hardwood shut down in the late 1970s. Around the same time, the federal government went in and replaced the three-room shanties with sawmill shut down. The national papermaker Crown Zellerback was in full operation. In the late 1950s, the company had constructed a huge $31 million plant in West Feliciana on the banks of the Mississippi River. The plant hired hundreds of workers when it opened in 1959, and many of them were African Americans.
People were able to get off the farm and go there and get a job. It was hard labor, but they felt it was getting paid great, and it were compared to what anybody else was paying, and most time what they could make on the farm.
Reverend Alton Scott's father, Willie Bennett Scott, was one of the first black men hired at the paper mill. That job allowed him to add on to the property his wife had inherited from her father, Henry Dunbar. The family went on to build a home on the property. Reverend Scott and other family members still live on that property today. As time went by, blacks discovered that Crown Zellerback had stopped hiring people from West Feliciana Parish, but the plant was hiring from neighboring parishes.
The civil rights movement was taking off. A guy, Ronnie Moe, was kind of heading the civil rights movement. For black people in that parish, they was talking to these people at the paper mill. Why are you not hiring these people? I'd taken the test, told me I failed the test, and everybody, if you was from that parish, the answer we was getting, well, they didn't pass the test. Well, I got real curious, and some other people said, well, look, I think I passed the test. If I went out my test, they would just told me, no, you can't have it. Ronnie Moe knew enough to know with your operation, you can't hide this kind of stuff. If they didn't pass the test, then we won't see it. But I heard already what was going on. These big farmers was telling them, look, we don't mind you operating here, but you can't hire our labor out of this parish. And they didn't. So when it kind of put the pressure on them and started asking questions, they hired a guy, Evan White, then they hired me. But right behind that was a whole bunch of people from that parish, like Alton Scott, Willis Stevens, Edward Sterner. Now they were doing extension. They needed plenty of labor, but they were also putting in the labor, but they wasn't coming out of that parish.
Hamp Williams was the second black man promoted to foreman at the paper mill. He says the skills he learned working in the fields, frequently for other people, gave him a major advantage.
But Uncle Lot and Ed Daniel was my idol. Those were people I watched.
The international conglomerate Timbeck bought the Crown Zellerback plant in 2001 and kept it operating until 2007. Hamp Williams was the last person working in the ground wood department when Timbeck shut it down. He had worked at the paper mill for 40 years. Williams says he never had a problem as a union worker or a manager.
I thought I was as good as anybody who walked the planet, and I'm equal. I was treated that way. I treated everybody else that way. So I never had an instance in supervision where I had a problem with race or color.
The mill underwent some instability until Hood Containers purchased it in 2015 and committed to plowing more than $100 million into overhauling the plant. A few years earlier, Princeville Canning Company had merged with Joan of Arc before being bought out by a Belgian company. The canning company eventually shut down. Peter Truitt says the lay of the land in West Feliciana Parish was not ideal for the huge equipment that makes farming easier, requiring less manual labor.
For the most part, the farms were small plots of sweet potatoes, and the harvesters in those days and in the current days are more efficient with large fields. And eventually, the larger farms displaced the smaller farms because it was more efficient for the harvesters.
There was another source of work in West Feliciana Parish. The Louisiana State Prison at Angola began housing prisoners in 1901. Workers were needed to oversee the inmates at the second largest high-security facility in the United States. Angola did not start hiring African Americans until the late 1960s. The prison has a capacity to house roughly 5,000 inmates, but the population has sometimes exceeded 6,000. It has also dropped far below 5,000. It's estimated that at least 1,800 employees are needed to meet the basic security needs of the prison when it reaches full capacity. The state has had major issues with funding and staffing the prison ever since it opened. Published reports reveal that between the 1940s and 1970s, guards supervised inmates, and some of those inmates carried rifles and tried to oversee other inmates. The result was an atmosphere engulfed in rapes, stabbings, and murders. Longtime prison reporters and inmates Billy Sinclair and Wilbert Rito reported that as many as 3,000 inmates died at Angola over a period of 3 decades because of inadequate care and supervision. By the mid-1970s, the federal court stepped in and demanded improvements. Today, a large percentage of the prison's workforce is now black and female. As the nation entered the 1960s, friction mounted between blacks and whites in West Feliciana over voting rights. Excluding inmates at Angola, the 1960 census counted about 7,000 black people in West Feliciana compared to about 4,000 whites. Blacks had a clear majority and wanted to flex their voting strength, but whites had almost all the land and the money. Civil rights activist Ronnie Moore says the St. Francisville area was one of the last parts of Louisiana that tried to deny blacks the right to vote. The situation was so intense that the nation's most prominent black magazine, Ebony, shared the story with the rest of the nation. Bob Adelman captured an image of a gun-toting minister guarding his home. The Reverend Joe Carter led the successful campaign to ensure blacks could vote, becoming the first black man in the parish to register after several failed attempts.
When the parish started moving towards civil rights and the right to vote, a lot of black was living on the plantation. And because the black wanted to vote, they made a move off the plantation. Some was able to buy land and build a home. Some had to even leave the parish is because they couldn't afford to buy land.
One white landowner evicted Ernest and Susie Morgan and their children after the Morgans registered to vote. Vincent Smith recalls the story Susie Morgan told his mother about her husband Ernest.
When Mr. Fred Jackson So Ernest Morgan at the courthouse, October 17, 1963, he told her they had to move. And that's when Miss Susan told Mama, Mr. Ernest hardly and cried. But see, that was the best thing ever happened to them. They went right to Solitude and bought their own house and land.
Since then, the Morgans have built a second house on their own property. And most of the Morgan children went to college and all lead successful, independent lives.
Most of the black churches were either on rented or leased property or donated by Caucasian family who had more resources than they did, even providing cemeteries and whatnot. Some people probably didn't come out boldly and speak their views as far as the civil rights movement. Out of fear, you were very cautious and careful in what you said and did because you wanted to try to keep what you had. You didn't want to make matters worse.
Many of the blacks who grew up in the St. Francisville area during and after the John S. Dawson era went off to college and got great jobs. They benefited greatly from the community being less than 50 miles from Southern University. And there was train service between St. Francisville and Baton Rouge in the early years.
Southern was everything. That's the only black college that's close right there in Baton Rouge.
Whatever you need came out of Dawson High. You have doctors, you have lawyers, you have judges, you have teachers, you have nurses, a secretary. It's because the kids was more focused on their education and what could I do to better my condition.
There's a long list of success stories from Dawson High. Joseph McDonough Jr. became a judge in South Carolina. Leandre Williams received his doctorate degree and worked in some of the highest positions with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Southern University, and LSU. Fannie Williams served as a probation officer and community activist in Austin, Texas. Isaac Dixon Smith became a general in the United States Army.
He was always smart, he born smart. He finished Southern as a second lieutenant in the United States Army and went on, he made a two-star general. I had 5 sisters, and all of them were born right here and worked in the fields, finished high school, and went to Southern University.
The Scotts also excelled in their professions.
Milton went in accounting.
Milton Scott finished college at Southern University with the highest grade point average in his class. He then went on to work for the Fortune 500 company Arthur Andersen, which supplied accountants for companies on an international scale. Milton then went to Dynergy, a power company based in Houston, before becoming the co-founder of a company called Complete Energy Holdings.
Elvin died very young, but he was in real estate and he was doing very well.
Elvin had already racked up millions of dollars in sales of homes in the Glen Oaks and Park Forest neighborhoods in Baton Rouge before starting his own real estate company. He was a licensed real estate broker.
Boys went to business school. My brother Calvin, he went to the service, auto mechanic. My brother Willie, he worked at the mill.
Willie continued his education and earned a master's degree. By then, however, the benefits of staying at the paper mill exceeded changing careers. Reverend Scott got a doctorate degree in theology and has been pastor of St. Peter Baptist Church in West Feliciana Parish for more than 2 decades. Reverend Scott also serves on many boards in the parish, including those that manage the parish hospital and the Voters League. The 2020 census revealed that West Feliciana Parish now has a population of roughly 10,500 people, about 70% of whom are white. Many young African Americans grow up, go off to college, and to careers in other cities and states. At the same time, many whites, especially those with children, are flocking to the parish, and with good reason.
We have the lowest crime rates in the state, the lowest unemployment rates in the state, one of the best school systems in the state. Depending on how you look at it, we could be number 1, number 2, and it's always been traditionally right there. It's holding strong.
There is, however, pushback over a recent ordinance that seeks to limit the number of houses that can be built in the parish. The apparent goal is to have no more than 1 house on almost 2 acres of land in most areas. Reverend Scott says the rules are harmful to poor people, mostly blacks, who have smaller plots.
it make it difficult for my people to be able to build a house because we don't have the land. You have 3 children. You have 3 acres of land. And the way that thing is drawn up, I'm almost sure 2 of them would be able to build a house on the land. It tied our hand. If you have 150 acres of land, that's a different thing. And we need to change our thoughts. Just because I'm okay for my children, I need to be looking out for yours too.
Parish President Kenny Havard says the ordinance was put in place primarily to get major developers to be more responsible for water, sewer, and road services in new neighborhoods without putting a major tax burden on people already living in the parish.
Our infrastructure is stressed to the max. Most of our roads are 17 feet wide. We had an engineering study on them. They rated, A through F, and the majority of them are F rated. We get about $111.26 per $400,000 house. To do a mile of road is about $1 million, $800,000 to $1 million. So we would have to build somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 houses to pay for that mile of road. And it just doesn't work out.
Havard says the parish has major problems with some of its bridges. They've been able to repair almost 30 since he took office 5 years ago, but much more work needs to be done. He says the new ordinance does accommodate families wanting to build 5 houses on 5 acres. Havard resists the idea of grandfathering into the ordinance accommodations for African American families whose ancestors lived through slavery and sharecropping in West Feliciana.
I don't think we should carve out any special thing for anybody. I think we should move on and quit looking back into the past.
Everyone agrees that it's now difficult for anyone to get a start in West Feliciana Parish if they don't have deep pockets.
Right back of me is White Oak subdivision. I think the lots is selling for $65,000 a lot. I really don't know the true answer to why the land and everything went up so high.
You can throw comps kind of out the window right now because people are paying whatever it'll take to get here. There's a subdivision that's 1 acre. It's $250,000 they're selling some of the lots for. 1 acre lots.
With property values high and still rising in West Feliciana, the older generation is convinced younger people will have to work as hard or harder than they did to reach their goals. But they also believe the opportunities exist, even if not in West Feliciana.
You have to want something out of life in order to accomplish anything out of life. 50% of success starts with you. You have to believe in self and believe that I can do this. And if you set your mind on it to do it, you can get it done.
You have to know where you're going. Opportunities come. You got to be able to see it and you utilize it. And you got to realize that the world is bigger than in the back.